In the summer of 1998, a 26-year-old woman stepped out of a bridal room in a small church outside Maple Ridge, Ohio, telling her best friend she would be right back. She left her purse on the vanity. Her bouquet sat in a glass of water beside the mirror. Her veil draped over the back of a wooden chair exactly where she'd set it moments earlier. She walked out the side door into the July heat, and no one alive ever saw Lillian Hayes again. 21 years passed. The case went cold. The community moved on. Grant Mercer, the man who was supposed to marry her that afternoon, spent 2 decades watching people look at him differently at the grocery store, at church, at the hardware shop where he bought his morning coffee. He never remarried. He never left Maple Ridge. And he never once believed the explanation the police handed him. Then, in the spring of 2019, a single restored wedding photograph pulled a thread that no one had noticed was there. And what unraveled wasn't just a cold case. It was a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for over 2 decades, buried under assumptions, missed connections, and one man's quiet refusal to let go. This is the story of Lillian Hayes, and it doesn't begin the way you'd expect. To understand what happened on that Saturday in July, you have to understand who Lillian was before the dress, before the veil, before the church filled with folding chairs and white lilies. You have to understand the woman who spent her Friday evenings at her parents' kitchen table helping her younger sister Naomi with college applications. The woman who called her grandmother every Sunday without fail, even when the conversation was mostly silence and the sound of a television in the background. The woman who worked as a records clerk at the county administrative office, a job most people found tedious, but one Lillian genuinely loved because she believed order mattered. That keeping things in their proper place was a small act of care for the people who would come after you. She met Grant Mercer at a community fundraiser in the fall of 1995. He was fixing a broken table leg in the church basement while she organized donation envelopes at a folding table nearby. He looked up, saw her struggling with a jammed stapler, and said, "You want me to hit that thing, or are you going to negotiate with it?" She laughed. He fixed the stapler. They talked for 2 hours while everyone else packed up around them. Their courtship was quiet, steady, the kind of relationship built on shared silence as much as conversation. Grant worked construction. Lillian kept files and records. On weekends, they drove out to the farmland east of town, where her late Uncle Thomas had once grown soybeans, walking the fence lines, talking about nothing important, which somehow felt like the most important thing in the world. Her father, Richard Hayes, was a retired postal worker who expressed love through small, practical gestures. He fixed her car without being asked. He left the porch light on every night she drove home after dark. Her mother, Diane, was warmer, louder, the kind of woman who cried at television commercials and hugged you a little too long at the door. Lillian was their eldest, the responsible one, the one who remembered birthdays, who organized Thanksgiving, who made sure Naomi never felt overlooked. Naomi was 22 in the summer of '98, finishing her teaching degree at a state university 2 hours south. She and Lillian talked on the phone 3, maybe 4 times a week. Their conversations were ordinary. Recipes, gossip about mutual friends, whether their mother had finally fixed the leaking kitchen faucet. Nothing remarkable, which is exactly what made what came next so impossible to accept. The wedding was planned for Saturday, July 18th, a small ceremony. 43 guests. The church was Grace Community, a white clapboard building with a gravel parking lot and a single oak tree shading the front steps. Diane had made the cake. Richard had built the wooden arch himself, sanding it smooth over 3 weekends. Naomi was flying in Thursday. Grant's brother was handling the music. Lillian's maid of honor was her college roommate, a woman named Carla Fenton, who drove up from Columbus the night before. Friday evening, the rehearsal went smoothly. Lillian wore jeans and a plain white t-shirt, walking the aisle in sneakers while Carla held the train of a dress that wouldn't be worn until tomorrow. Grant stood at the front in his work boots, grinning. Richard kept adjusting the arch by fractions of an inch. Diane cried twice and blamed allergies both times. After the rehearsal, Lillian and Grant sat on the church steps eating cold pizza from a cardboard box. The sun was dropping behind the tree line. Crickets were starting up in the tall grass beyond the parking lot. "You nervous?" Grant asked. She tore a piece of crust and considered it. "No," she said. "I've been nervous for 3 years. Tomorrow I just get to stop being nervous." He laughed. She leaned her shoulder against his. They sat there until the light went amber, then purple, then dark. Saturday morning arrived hot and still. The kind of Ohio summer day where the air feels thick enough to hold. Carla arrived at the church by 9 to help Lillian dress. The bridal room was a small space off the main hallway, barely larger than a closet, with a single window looking out toward the back parking area. A mirror, a chair, a small table where Lillian set her purse, her grandmother's pearl earrings, and the bouquet of white roses Grant had picked up from the florist that morning. Naomi called at 10. Lillian answered, already half into the dress, the phone pressed between her ear and shoulder. "How do I look?" Lillian asked. "I can't see you." "Then use your imagination," Naomi laughed. "You look beautiful. Mom's already crying. Dad's pretending he isn't. Tell him the arch is perfect." I told him. He moved it another inch. They talked for a few minutes. Normal things. The weather. Uncle Gerald was bringing his new girlfriend. Normal things. The weather. Uncle Gerald was bringing his new girlfriend. Whether the cake would survive the drive from their parents' house. Then Lillian said she had to go, that Carla was trying to pin her veil and kept sticking her with a needle. "See you in a few hours," Naomi said. "See you in a few hours," Lillian repeated. It was the last time they spoke. The ceremony was set for 2 in the afternoon. Guests began arriving around 1. Richard stood near the entrance shaking hands, directing people to their seats. Diane hovered near the cake table straightening napkins that didn't need straightening. Grant waited in the front room with his brother, adjusting his tie for the 4th time. At 1:15, Carla knocked on the bridal room door. Lillian was sitting in front of the mirror, fully dressed, veil in place, touching up her lipstick. She looked, Carla would later tell police, calm, happy. "Not nervous anymore?" "There's a note," Carla said, sliding a small folded piece of paper under the door. "Someone left it at the front desk, said it was for you." Lillian unfolded it. Carla, standing just inside the doorway, watched her read it. Lillian's expression didn't change much. A slight furrow, a tilt of the head. She folded the paper and set it on the table beside her purse. "What is it?" Carla asked. "Someone wants to talk to me outside." "Just 5 minutes," they said. Lillian stood, smoothing the front of her dress. "Something about Uncle Thomas. I'll be right back. Want me to come with you?" "No." You wrinkled the dress trying to squeeze through that hallway. 5 minutes. She kissed Carla's cheek. "Save me a seat up front." She walked out. Carla watched her disappear down the narrow service hallway toward the side door. The clock on the wall read 1:17, 1:20, 1:20, 1:25, 1:30. Carla checked her watch. Checked the hallway. Stepped outside into the parking lot. The gravel was empty. The oak tree cast its shade across the front steps where guests were gathering. No sign of Lillian. 1:35, 1:40. The ceremony was supposed to start at 2. Guests were seated. The pianist played soft hymns. Richard kept glancing toward the back. Diane stopped straightening napkins. At 1:50, Carla told Grant's brother something was wrong. At 1:55, Grant himself walked back to the bridal room. The door was open. The purse sat on the table. The bouquet stood in its glass. The veil lay across the chair. The pearl earrings rested on a tissue where Lillian had set them after putting them on. But Lillian was gone. And her engagement ring, the simple gold band Grant had placed on her finger 8 months earlier, was no longer there. If you've ever sat in a room where someone you love is supposed to walk through the door and doesn't, you know what those next minutes feel like. Grant checked the parking lot, the bathrooms, the hallway, the small kitchen in the back. Richard walked the perimeter of the church property. Diane stood in the bridal room touching the veil, saying her daughter's name quietly, as if Lillian might answer from inside the walls. By 2:15, someone called the police. And here's the question that would follow Grant Mercer for the next 21 years, the question that kept him awake at 3 in the morning, the question he asked every detective, every deputy, every sheriff who ever opened that file. Lillian Hayes left her purse, her veil, her bouquet, her grandmother's earrings, everything that marked her as a bride, as a woman about to walk toward the life she'd chosen. She left all of it behind, but she took off her ring. Why would a woman who was happy, who was calm, who had just kissed her best friend and said 5 minutes. Why would she remove her engagement ring before stepping outside to talk to someone for 5 minutes? And who was waiting for her? If this story has already pulled you in, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next, because the answer to that question stayed buried for 2 decades. The first officers to arrive were Deputy Kevin Marsh and his partner, a younger deputy named Todd Ellison. They walked the church property in the July heat, their shirts dark with sweat by the time they circled back to the bridal room. They photographed everything: the purse, the bouquet, the veil, the earrings on their tissue, the small table, the chair, the window overlooking the back parking area which was latched from the inside. They interviewed Carla first. She sat in the church kitchen with her hands wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't touched, repeating the same sequence. The note, the 5 minutes, the kiss on the cheek, the hallway, the side door. 117. Did she seem upset? Deputy Marsh asked. No, West. Deputy Marsh asked. No. That's the thing. She seemed fine. Curious, maybe. Like someone had reminded her of something she needed to take care of. Did she say who the note was from? No. She just said someone wanted to talk. Something about her uncle. Marsh wrote that down. Uncle Thomas Hayes had been dead for 4 years. A heart attack at 53. He'd owned a stretch of farmland east of Maple Ridge that sat mostly fallow after his passing. Nothing unusual there. Small towns held on to land the way families held on to grudges, quietly and for longer than anyone could reasonably explain. The note itself was gone. Lillian had taken it with her, or it had been taken from her. No one could say which. By 4 that afternoon, the search had expanded beyond the church property. Volunteers combed the tree line. A helicopter out of the county seat flew grid patterns over the surrounding farmland. Grant walked with them for 3 hours before his brother physically pulled him back to the parking lot, where he sat on the bumper of his truck with his tie undone and his hands shaking in a way he couldn't control. Richard Hayes organized the volunteer groups with the quiet efficiency of a man who had sorted mail for 31 years. He assigned sectors. He handed out water bottles. He did not cry. Diane sat in the church pew where she'd been arranging programs an hour earlier, and she did not move for a long time. When Naomi finally arrived, driving 2 hours north with her phone pressed to her ear and her knuckles white on the steering wheel, she found her mother exactly where the volunteers had left her, still holding a stack of folded programs, still saying Lillian's name every few minutes, soft, like a prayer she wasn't sure anyone was hearing. The first 48 hours followed the pattern you'd expect. Canvassing, door to door along the county roads, checking hospitals, door to along the county roads, checking hospitals, checking bus stations, the Greyhound stop in town, the Amtrak station 40 minutes south. Lillian's car, a 9-year-old blue sedan, sat in the church parking lot where she'd left it that morning. The keys were in her purse. On the third day, Detective Sandra Voss took over the case from the initial deputies. She was 44. Methodical, the kind of investigator who kept 3 notebooks going at once and cross-referenced everything by hand. She started with the obvious question. Had Lillian planned to leave? The answer came from a bank teller at the Maple Ridge Community Branch. 6 days before the wedding, on a Monday morning, Lillian Hayes had walked in and withdrawn $3,000 in cash from her savings account. The teller remembered because it was unusual. Lillian banked there every week. She deposited. She checked her balance. She never pulled more than $200 at a time. Was she agitated? Voss asked the teller. No. Polite. A little distracted, maybe. She asked me twice if the withdrawal would show up on a joint statement. Joint statement? She and her fiancé had a shared checking account, but the savings was hers alone. She wanted to make sure he wouldn't see it. Voss brought Grant in the next morning. He sat across from her in the interview room at the sheriff's office, still wearing the same clothes from Saturday. He hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed but steady. $3,000, Voss said. 6 days before the wedding, did you know? No. The word came out flat. Not defensive, just tired. I didn't know. Did she mention needing money for anything? Honeymoon expenses? A gift? No. We'd already paid for everything. The honeymoon was a cabin up near Lake Erie. 2 nights. Already booked. He paused. Swallowed. She'd been, though. The last couple of weeks. Distracted, she kept getting letters. Letters in the mail. The last and never there. In the mail. No return address. Handwritten. She'd read them and put them away. I asked her once what they were. She said it was nothing. Family stuff. She didn't want to talk about it. He rubbed his face with both hands. I didn't push. I thought maybe it was wedding stress. Or something about her uncle's estate. She'd been sorting through his papers. Voss noted it. Anonymous letters. No return address. A withdrawal meant to stay hidden from her fiancé. It wasn't enough to build a theory on, but it was enough to shift the tone of the investigation. The question was no longer simply, where did she go? It was becoming, was she planning to go? The florist, a woman named Peggy Alderman who ran a small shop on Main Street, came forward on the 5th day. She'd been delivering the remaining centerpieces to the church that morning and remembered seeing Lillian outside, behind the building, talking to an older man. He was tall, gray hair, maybe 60, wore a khaki jacket even though it was hot out. Peggy frowned, trying to hold the image. They weren't arguing. She seemed calm. He was talking, gesturing a little, like he was explaining something. Did you hear what they said? No. I was carrying boxes. I just glanced over. Then I went inside. Voss showed Peggy the guest list. 43 names. She went through each one. No match. She showed photographs of extended family, church members, Grant's co-workers, Mann's co-workers. Peggy shook her head at all of them. I'm sorry. I only saw him for a few seconds. He could have been, I don't know, a delivery person, someone from the county office. I just remember the jacket. The lead went nowhere. Voss noted in her file that the witness may have confused another guest or vendor for the bride. Given the distance and the brief observation, the description was too vague to act on. Gray hair, khaki jacket, 60 years old. In a town where half the men over 50 fit that description, it was a dead end. 2 weeks after the disappearance, Voss obtained a warrant for Lillian's apartment. It was a small one-bedroom above a laundromat on Elm Street. Neat, organized, books alphabetized on a shelf, a calendar on the kitchen wall with the wedding date circled in red ink and the small heart drawn beside it. In the bottom drawer of her nightstand, they found a sealed manila envelope. Written across the front in Lillian's handwriting were the words, "If anything happens to me." Voss opened it carefully, expecting a letter, a confession, an explanation, a name. Inside were 3 sheets of blank white paper. Nothing written, nothing printed. Just empty pages, clean and unmarked. But the envelope told its own story. The seal had been broken and re-glued. The adhesive was uneven, slightly yellowed compared to the original factory seal. Someone had opened this envelope after Lillian disappeared and put it back together. Someone had been in this apartment, in this drawer, between the Saturday Lillian vanished and the Tuesday police arrived with their warrant. Voss photographed the envelope, bagged it, sent it for fingerprint analysis. The results came back in clunts of too many overlapping prints from handling. Nothing usable. The blank pages bothered her. Why would Lillian write that label, prepare that envelope, and leave it empty? Was it a placeholder? Had she intended to fill it later, or had someone removed whatever was inside? She never got a satisfying answer. Not then. A month into the investigation, attention shifted toward Grant. Not because of evidence. Because of a conversation. Lillian Hayes, in a moment of grief and confusion, told a neighbor that Lillian and Grant had argued 2 nights before the wedding. Thursday evening. A real argument. Voices raised. Lillian had come home to her parents' house afterward, upset, refusing to say what it was about. She'd gone back to Grant's apartment the next morning and everything seemed fine. But the argument had happened. Voss brought Grant in again. He confirmed it. They'd argued about the seating arrangement, about whether to invite a cousin Grant didn't get along with. Small things that had built up under wedding pressure. He said Lillian had been tense, distracted, snapping at little things. He'd asked if something was wrong. She'd said no. He'd pushed. She'd gotten angry. He'd let it go. That's it, Voss asked. That's it. He passed every interview. Every question. He submitted to a polygraph voluntarily. The results were inconclusive, which in practice meant nothing useful. He had no scratches, no bruises, no inconsistencies in his timeline. His brother confirmed he'd been at the apartment all Friday night. His employer confirmed he'd been at a job site Saturday morning until 11, but the suspicion settled over him like dust. Quiet, persistent, impossible to wipe clean. At the hardware store, conversations stopped when he walked in. At church, people smiled too wide, asked how he was doing with a careful gentleness that made his jaw tighten. He stopped going to the coffee shop on Main Street, stopped attending the Friday night gatherings at the VFW hall. He went to work. He came home. He sat in the apartment where Lillian's toothbrush still stood in the bathroom cup, and he waited for a phone call that never came. Richard Hayes, in his quiet way, accepted the police theory. Voluntary disappearance. The cash withdrawal. The anonymous letters she wouldn't discuss. The argument. The blank envelope. It painted a picture of a woman under pressure who chose to walk away. Richard didn't like the picture, but he could live inside it. He could tell himself his daughter was alive somewhere, starting over, and that was enough to get him through the morning. Diane could not. She wouldn't leave the earrings, Diane said, over and over, to anyone who would listen. To Voss. To Naomi. To the neighbor. To the pastor. Those were her grandmothers. She wore them to every important moment since she was 16. She would not take them off and walk away. She would not. No one had a good answer for that. 8 months after Lillian vanished, a woman named Ruth Kessler walked into the sheriff's office in the neighboring county. She'd received 3 anonymous letters over the past year. Handwritten. No return address. The letters referenced a property dispute involving farmland she'd inherited from her late husband. They warned her not to sign certain documents. They mentioned names she recognized from county records. The handwriting, she told the deputy who took her statement, looked almost identical to a sample she'd seen in a newspaper article about the Hayes disappearance. A letter Lillian had written to the editor months before the wedding, published in the Maple Ridge Gazette. The deputy noted the similarity, forwarded the file to Voss's office. But Voss had moved on to other cases. The Hayes file was technically still open, but no one was actively working it. The connection between Ruth Kessler's letters and Lillian's anonymous notes was logged, filed, and forgotten. If you're still following this case, hit subscribe, because what happened next stayed buried for 21 years. The years accumulated. Richard Hayes died in 2007, 9 years after his daughter disappeared. Heart failure. Quiet, in his sleep. Diane said he went believing Lillian had chosen another life, that she was alive, that she was alive, that she was alive, that she simply didn't want to be found. He never said it with peace. He said it the way a man says the weather is what it is. Because the alternative was a weight he couldn't carry. Diane lived another 6 years after that. She kept Lillian's room at the family house exactly as it was. The bed made. The books on the shelf. The calendar still on the wall. The wedding date still circled. The small red heart still drawn beside it. She never moved the furniture, never painted the walls. When Naomi visited, she'd find her mother sitting in that room sometimes, folding and refolding a sweater that didn't need folding. Grant stayed. He stayed in Maple Ridge. He stayed in the apartment. He kept his job. He mowed his lawn. He nodded at neighbors who couldn't quite meet his eyes. And every July 18th, he drove out to Grace Community Church, sat in the empty parking lot for an hour, and drove home. 21 years. And then Naomi Hayes opened a box of holiday decorations in her mother's attic and found something no one had seen since 1998. The box was labeled Christmas Kitchen in Diane's careful handwriting. Naomi had gone up to the attic on a Saturday morning in March of 2019, sorting through her late mother's belongings before the house went on the market. Diane had passed the previous October. Quietly. In the same bedroom where she'd spent the last years of her life folding and refolding Lillian's sweater. Naomi was 43 now. A 4th-grade teacher in a small town south of Columbus. Married. 2 kids. A life that looked from the outside steady and whole. But every July 18th still carved a hollow space in her chest that nothing else could fill. She'd been sorting for 3 hours. Ornaments wrapped in newspaper. Tangled lights. Tangled lights. A ceramic nativity scene with a chipped shepherd. She was tired, her knees aching from the attic floor, when she lifted a strand of green garland and felt something hard beneath it. A book, small, cloth-bound, the color of dark wine. She pulled it free and opened the cover. Lillian's handwriting. Neat, slanted, precise. The handwriting of a woman who filed records for a living and believed that order was a form of love. It was a journal, not a diary, exactly. More like a working notebook. Dates ran from January to June of 1998. The early entries were ordinary. Grocery lists, reminders to call the caterer, a sketch of the church layout with little X marks for each guest seat. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The entries grew shorter, more urgent. The handwriting pressed harder into the paper. February 14th. Saw something at the Whitmore fundraiser I shouldn't have. Documents passed between R and another man, property transfer forms, county seals. They didn't see me. I don't know what it means yet. March 3rd. Check the records at the office. Parcel numbers don't match. The farmland east of town, Uncle Thomas's land, the Kessler property. Boundaries have been redrawn, officially, but the original surveys say something different. March 19th. Anonymous letter again. Fourth one. They know I'm looking. They don't say what they'll do. They don't have to. April 7th. Talked to a man at the county building, older. Said he knew Uncle Thomas. Said the land dispute was never settled. Said people had been moving records for years. He seemed scared. I don't think he's one of them. I think he's trapped. May 2nd. I have copies. 3 counties. Certified. Cost me everything in savings, but I have them. If I go public now, before the wedding, it blows up. Grant gets pulled in. Mom and Dad get pulled in. I can't do that to them. Not before the wedding. After the honeymoon. I'll take everything to the state office. Clean. Quiet. Protected. June 28th. 12 days before the wedding. He called again. The man from the county building. Said he has proof about Uncle Thomas. Said it can't wait. I told him after the wedding. He sounded desperate about Uncle Thomas. Said it can't wait. I told him after the wedding. He sounded desperate. I don't know if I trust him, but I don't think he's dangerous. I think he gets acquainted. And I think he can quant. The final entry was dated July 16th, 2 days before the wedding. If anything happens to me, the copies are safe. Not in the apartment. Not where they'll look. I'm sorry I can't tell Grant. I'm sorry I can't tell anyone. I just need 5 more days. Then it's over. Naomi sat on the attic floor with the journal in her lap and her hands trembling. She read the last entry 4 times. Then she closed the book, pressed it against her chest, and cried in a way she hadn't cried since she was 22, driving north with her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Her sister hadn't run. Her sister hadn't chosen another life. Her sister had been trying to protect them. Naomi called the sheriff's office the next morning. Then she called Grant. She hadn't spoken to him in over a year. The conversation was short, awkward. 21 years of shared grief didn't make phone calls easy. I found something, she said. I need you to come look at it. He came that afternoon. He stood in Naomi's kitchen, reading the journal with his reading glasses perched on his nose, his lips moving slightly over the words. When he finished, he set the book down on the table, removed his glasses, folded them, set them beside the book down on the table, removed his glasses, folded them, set them beside the book. She was protecting us, he said. His voice was rough, not angry. Something older than anger. All those years, everyone thought that I did something, and she was protecting us. Naomi didn't know what to say. She poured him coffee. He didn't drink it. They sat in silence for a long time. The journal changed the shape of the case, but it was the photographs that broke it open. Naomi had been planning a small memorial display for the 21st anniversary. A table at the community center, Lillian's school pictures, her graduation photo, a few candid shots from family gatherings, and the wedding photographs. The ones Carla had taken that morning in the bridal room, the ones from the rehearsal. A handful of images that had existed only as negatives, never printed, stored in a small envelope in Diane's keepsake box. Naomi brought the negatives to a restoration shop in Columbus, a small studio run by a technician named Dale Furr, a patient, meticulous man in his 50s who specialized in recovering damaged and faded film. The negatives were in decent condition, slightly warped from age. A few scratches, nothing he couldn't work with. He scanned them at high resolution, cleaned the dust, adjusted the contrast, printed test copies for Naomi to review. Standard work. He'd done it hundreds of times. But on the fourth negative, a shot taken inside the church during the rehearsal, something caught his eye. The image showed the main sanctuary, the wooden pews, the arch Richard had built. In the background, through the tall window on the east wall, there was a reflection. Faint, easy to miss. The shape of a man standing outside, partially obscured by the window frame. Dale almost dismissed it. A guest, a passerby, nothing unusual, but something about the posture bothered him. The man wasn't looking toward the ceremony. He was looking directly into the church, watching, and in his hands, held at chest height, was a small rectangular shape, folded, the size of a note. Dale enhanced the image, adjusted the brightness, cropped and magnified the reflection. The man's face was partially visible. Older, gray hair, a khaki jacket despite the summer heat, and in his hands, unmistakable now, a folded piece of paper. He called Naomi. The image went to the sheriff's office, then to the state bureau. Facial recognition software, far more advanced than anything available in '98, ran the enhanced reflection against public records, employment databases, archived county photographs. 3 days later, they had a name. Owen Rutledge, 64 years old at the time of the wedding. A former county building inspector who had worked in the Maple Ridge Administrative Office for 22 years before retiring in 1996. He died in 2011. Liver failure. Alone in a rented room outside town. No family. No close friends. No one had attended the funeral. Owen Rutledge had never appeared in the original investigation. Not as a suspect. Not as a witness. Not as a name in any file. And yet, there he was, standing outside the church window on the day Lillian Hayes disappeared, holding what looked exactly like the note she'd received minutes before she walked out the side door. Detective Marcus Webb, assigned to the reopened case, pulled Owen's employment records. 22 years as a building inspector. He'd had access to every county building in the district. Courthouses, administrative offices, records rooms. He'd held keys to locked file cabinets, service hallways, storage rooms. He'd known where every document was kept and who had authority to move them. Webb dug deeper. Owen's personnel file mentioned a disciplinary note from 1991, a complaint filed by a local farmer regarding a property boundary assessment. The farmer's name was Thomas Hayes, Lillian's uncle. The complaint had been dismissed. The file noted that Owen and Thomas had a prior professional disagreement regarding survey lines on farmland east of town. The connection was thin. A 7-year-old complaint, a dead man, a dead inspector. But it was the first thread that led somewhere. Webb requested access to the county property records archive. What he found made him sit back in his chair and stare at the file folder for a long time. Parcel records for the farmland east of Maple Ridge. Thomas Hayes's land. The Kessler property. 3 adjacent parcels. The record showed transfers filed in 1997 and early '98. Ownership changes. Boundary adjustments. New survey maps replacing old ones. All properly stamped. All bearing county seals. But the original surveys, the ones filed in the 1970s when the land was first parceled, told a different story. The boundaries didn't match. The acreage didn't match. The acreage didn't match. The acreage didn't match. The acreage hid gaps. Pages missing from the physical files. Entire sections of the transfer log simply absent, as if someone had carefully removed them and replaced them with cleaner versions. And the dates on the missing pages, the ones that should have documented the original ownership chain, fell within a 2-week window in July of 1998. The same week Lillian Hayes disappeared. Naomi read the journal entries again. Parcel numbers don't match. The farmland east of town. Boundaries have been redrawn, officially. But the original surveys say something different. Lillian had seen it. She documented it. She'd spent her savings pulling certified copies from 3 counties before the records could be altered further, and she'd hidden those copies somewhere no one had thought to look. If you want to see how this case finally breaks open, subscribe now, because the next discovery changes everything. Webb obtained a warrant for Owen Rutledge's old residence. The rented room had been cleaned out years ago, turned over to new tenants, repainted, relet. Nothing remained. But the building manager, an elderly woman named Gloria Pask, remembered Owen. Quiet man, kept to himself, always carried a leather satchel, always locking and unlocking a metal lockbox he kept under his bed. After he died, Gloria told Webb, the county came and collected his things. 2 men. Sweets. They took the lockbox, told me it was county property. I didn't argue. Webb checked the county asset logs. No record of the collection. No receipt. No inventory. 2 men in suits had walked into a dead man's room, taken a metal lockbox, and walked out. No paperwork. No trail. He sat in his car in the parking lot of the rented building and thought about Lillian Hayes' journal. If anything happens to me, the copies are safe. Not in the apartment. Not where they'll look. Not where they'll. She'd hidden the evidence. Owen had known where it was, or believed he did, and someone had made sure that after Owen died, whatever he'd kept in that lockbox disappeared just as cleanly as the property records had. But Lillian's copies weren't in Owen's lockbox, they weren't in her apartment, they weren't in any file Webb had found so far. They were somewhere else. And the journal, the one Naomi had pulled from under a strand of Christmas garland, was the only map that might lead to them. Webb turned to the last entry again. Not in the apartment. Not where they'll look. Where would a woman who believed in order, who filed everything, who kept her grandmother's earrings wrapped in tissue and her books alphabetized, where would she put the most important documents of her life? Not where they'd look. But where was that? The answer came from an unlikely place. Webb's partner, a younger detective named Alicia Torres, was cross-referencing Lillian's bank records with county clerk fees when she noticed a pattern. $3,000. Withdrawn on a Monday. And in the following 4 days, 3 separate payments to 3 different county recorders' offices. Certified document requests. Property transfer histories. Original survey copies. Property transfer histories. Original survey copies. Each payment between $800 and $900. She wasn't running, Torres said, laying the receipts across Webb's desk. She was buying evidence. Certified copies from 3 counties, so no one could alter them after the fact. She spent every dollar of that withdrawal, making sure the records survived. Webb stared at the receipts. The original investigation had seen $3,000 in cash and built a narrative around it. A woman preparing to disappear. A bride getting cold feet. A voluntary exit. No one had checked where the money went, because no one had thought to ask what a records clerk would need $3,000 for. The answer had been sitting in plain sight for 21 years. Lillian Hayes hadn't been funding an escape. She'd been building a case. The next piece came from a man named Harold Dent, 78 years old, retired deputy. He'd been one of the responding officers in '98, part of the initial search team. Webb tracked him down at an assisted living facility outside Dayton, where he sat in a vinyl chair by a window, his hands resting on a walker. When Webb showed him Owen Rutledge's photograph, Harold's face changed. Not surprise, recognition, and something else. Shame. I knew that name, Harold said slowly. '98. A few weeks after the girl went missing, I was working the file. Pulled his employment record. Started making calls. Then my lieutenant pulled me into Wes. Told me to stop. Said there was nothing there. Said Rutledge was retired, irrelevant, a dead end. Harold's jaw tightened. I asked why. He said, and I remember this exact, he said, because I'm telling you there's nothing there, Harold. Didn't explain. Didn't give a reason. Just told me to close that thread and focus on the fiancé. Who was the lieutenant? Frank Bissell. Retired in 2003 and moved to Florida. Died about 5 years back. Harold paused. I should have pushed. I know that now. I was 29. He was my boss. I closed the thread. Webb noted the name. Frank Bissell. Dead. No way to interview him. But the instruction itself told a story. Someone in the sheriff's office in 1998 had actively steered the investigation away from Owen Rutledge. Not through negligence. Through command. Torres pulled the church maintenance records from Grace Community's storage closet. Decades of logs. Repair requests. Key assignments. Volunteer schedules. Buried in a folder from 1996, she found a service access log. Owen Rutledge, as a county building inspector, had been granted unrestricted key access to the church's locked service hallway during a renovation inspection. The hallway connected the main sanctuary to a side parking area behind the building, an area hidden from the front lot by a row of mature hedges, an area not visible to guests arriving for a wedding. The key had never been returned. The log showed no follow-up request. Owen had kept it. Webb interviewed the remaining wedding guests. Most remembered nothing useful. 21 years had softened every memory. But one woman, a church volunteer named Margaret Holt, who had been arranging hymnals that afternoon, remembered something. "I saw her," Margaret said, her voice careful, uncertain. "The bride. In the hallway. The side hallway. Not the main one. She was walking with a man. Older," Margaret said, her voice ermarred. "In the might. Tall, gray jacket. They were talking. She wasn't scared. She was listening, nodding, like he was telling her something important. Did you hear any of it?" Margaret closed her eyes, tried. "He said something about her uncle, about proof. He said it couldn't wait, that he'd been trying to reach her for weeks, and this was his last chance. She said, I think she said, all right. 5 minutes. And they went out the side door. Did she go willingly?" "Yes. That's what I remember. She went willingly. He wasn't pulling her. She wasn't struggling. She walked with him like she'd made a decision." Webb added it to the file. Lillian had followed Owen Rutledge out of the church because he claimed to have proof about her uncle. Proof she'd been seeking for months. She believed him. She went willingly. And she never came back. The financial trail took longer. Torres spent 3 weeks pulling property transfer records, corporate filings, and tax documents from the 1990s. The fraudulent land transfers weren't small. Parcel by parcel, boundary by boundary, someone had been redrawing ownership maps across 400 acres of farmland east of Maple Ridge. The original owners, Thomas Hayes, the Kessler family, 2 other elderly farmers, had been slowly displaced through forged surveys, altered deeds, and backdated transfer documents. The money flowed through a shell company registered in the next county, and behind that company, buried under 3 layers of paperwork, was a name Torres recognized from every local charity gala, every town council meeting, every ribbon-cutting ceremony in Maple Ridge for the past 30 years. Gerald Whitmore. Developer. Philanthropist. The man whose name was on the community center, the library wing, the youth baseball complex. The man who had hosted the fundraiser where Lillian first saw documents being exchanged. The man who smiled for cameras and shook hands at church potlucks and gave Thanksgiving turkeys to families who couldn't afford them. Owen Rutledge hadn't been acting alone. He'd been the mechanism. The man with the keys, the access, the knowledge of where every record lived. Gerald Whitmore had been the architect, and the land transfers, spread across a decade, were worth an estimated $4 million. Webb brought the file to the district attorney, then to the state attorney general's office. The case was no longer a missing person file. It was a homicide investigation wrapped inside 21 years of silence. But one question remained. The question that had haunted Gret Mercer for 2 decades. The question Diane Hayes had whispered to an empty room while folding the sweater that didn't need folding. Where was Lillian? The journal said she'd hidden the certified copies. Not in the apartment. Not where they'll look. Webb's team searched the family property. The church. The county office. Nothing. Then Torres went back to the journal. Read it again. Slowly. Uncle Thomas's land. The farmland east of town. Read it again. Slowly. Uncle Thomas's land. The farmland east of town. The land at the center of the dispute. The land Lillian had walked with Grant on weekend afternoons, tracing the fence lines, talking about nothing. Webb obtained old survey maps from the State Geological Archive. Originals from the 1970s. He overlaid them against modern satellite imagery. The boundaries didn't match, not just in the ways the fraud had altered them. There was a section near the eastern tree line, a stretch of ground that appeared on no modern map, no current parcel record, no active deed. A pocket of land that had been quietly erased from the official record, as if someone wanted to make sure no one ever looked there. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed on a Tuesday morning in late April. The field was soft from spring rain. The technician walked grid lines for 6 hours. At 4 in the afternoon, he stopped, pointed at his screen, called Webb over. 2 meters down. A disturbance, rectangular, the size and shape of a human form. The excavation took 2 days. Webb was there for both. Torres was there. Naomi was not. Webb had asked her whether she wanted to be present. She'd shaken her head. "Tell me when it's over," she'd said. "Tell me you found her." The remains were identified through dental records within a week. Lillian Hayes, 26 years old, buried in the farmland she'd walked on weekend afternoons, beneath soil that had been carefully replaced, beneath a stretch of ground that had been erased from every official map so that no surveyor, no inspector, no curious clerk would ever think to look there. The forensic examination confirmed what the journal had already whispered. Trauma to the skull. Inconsistent with a fall. Consistent with a single, forceful strike. She had been killed on the day she disappeared. Not days later, not weeks. The same afternoon she'd stepped out of the bridal room, walked down the service hallway, and followed a man who told her he had proof about her uncle. She'd gone willingly. She'd listened. And when she refused to hand over the documents she'd gathered, the certified copies from 3 counties, the evidence that would have unraveled $4 million in stolen land, she was killed and buried in the very ground the fraud was built on. The original investigation had spent 21 years asking whether Lillian Hayes chose to leave, whether she walked away from her wedding, her fiancé, her family, her life, whether the cash withdrawal and the anonymous letters in the blank envelope painted the picture of a woman who simply decided to disappear. No one had asked the other question, the question that should have been asked in the first 48 hours, the question that the untouched purse, the veil on the chair, the bouquet in its glass, the grandmother's earrings on their tissue, all of it had been screaming from the beginning. Why would a woman who was happy, who was calm, who had kissed her best friend and said, 5 minutes, why would she leave everything behind except the one thing she couldn't replace? The evidence. She hadn't left it behind, she'd taken it with her. And it had cost her everything. She'd taken it with her. And it had cost her everything. But one thread still hung loose. One detail that didn't fit. Owen Rutledge was dead. Gerald Whitmore was 81 years old, living in a gated community outside Columbus. The land fraud could be prosecuted. The cover-up could be documented. But the physical act, the burial, the 21 years of silence. Owen had been a building inspector, a quiet man, a man who carried a leather satchel and kept a lockbox under his bed, a man who seemed, in every witness account, more frightened than dangerous. Had he swung the blow himself, or had someone else been standing in that field, in that July heat, waiting for the answer Lillian refused to give? Webb pulled the last file, the one he'd been saving. The financial records didn't just show Whitmore Shell Company. They showed a second name, a partner, someone who had been at the fundraiser, someone who had been at the fundraiser, someone who had been at the church that day, someone whose name appeared on the original guest list, 43 names deep, in a seat near the back. Webb stared at the name, picked up the phone, and dialed. The name on the guest list was Raymond Whitmore, Gerald Whitmore's son, 34 years old in '98, listed as a colleague of Grant's brother, a connection so thin and ordinary that no one had questioned his presence at a 43-person wedding. He'd sat in the back row, shaken Richard's hand at the entrance, smiled at Diane near the cake table. And then, sometime between 1:17 and 2 o'clock on a hot July afternoon, he'd walked down a service hallway, out a side door, and into a field where a young woman was waiting for proof about her dead uncle. Webb's phone call went to the state attorney general's office. Within 48 hours, Raymond Whitmore was arrested at his home in Columbus. Gerald Whitmore, 81 and frail but sharp-eyed, was taken into custody the same morning. The charges were filed under seal: fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and for Raymond, murder. The interrogation took 3 days. Raymond said nothing for the first 2. On the third, his attorney negotiated, and the story came out in pieces. Flat, clinical, stripped of remorse, Owen Rutledge had been the inside man for nearly a decade. He'd altered surveys, swapped deed pages, redirected property tax records. Small changes, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Gerald Whitmore had directed the operation from a distance, using Owen's access to quietly absorb 400 acres of farmland that belonged to elderly owners who didn't understand what was happening to their property lines. But Lillian Hayes had seen the documents at the Whitmore fundraiser. She'd recognized the county seals. She'd cross-referenced the parcel numbers at her desk in the administrative office, and she'd started pulling certified copies from 3 counties, building a paper trail that would have unraveled everything. Owen had panicked. He'd been sending the anonymous letters trying to scare her into stopping. But Lillian hadn't stopped. She'd gotten more determined. So Owen had gone to Gerald, and Gerald had sent Raymond. The plan was simple. Owen would approach Lillian on the wedding day. He'd use the one subject he knew she couldn't resist: her uncle. Proof about the land dispute. He'd been trying to reach her for weeks, and the wedding was his last chance before she filed her evidence with the state. He'd lure her out the side door, into the service hallway, toward the hidden parking area. Raymond would be waiting. They wanted the documents, the certified copies from 3 counties. They wanted them handed over, destroyed, forgotten. And then Lillian would go back inside, marry Grant, take her honeymoon, and never look at a property record again. But Lillian hadn't brought the documents. She'd told Owen she'd already filed them somewhere safe, that they were beyond his reach, that after her honeymoon, the state investigators would have everything. Raymond struck her with a tire iron from the trunk of his car. One blow. She fell. She didn't get up. They buried her that night. Owen knew the land, knew which stretch had been erased from the modern surveys, knew where no one would dig, no one would build, no one would look. They removed her ring to make the scene in the bridal room suggest she'd chosen to leave. A woman who removed her engagement ring was a woman who'd made a decision. That was the story they wanted the police to build. And for 21 years, it worked. The blank envelope. Raymond had entered Lillian's apartment 2 days after the disappearance, using a key Owen had copied from the county office lockbox. He'd found the envelope labeled, "If anything happens to me." He'd opened it, expecting names, addresses, a confession. Inside was a single sheet with 3 words: "Check the records." No names. No explanation. Just a direction. He'd taken the sheet, replaced it with blank paper, resealed the envelope, and left. He hadn't understood what she meant. No one had. Because Lillian had hidden the actual evidence in the one place a records clerk would think of, and a developer's son never would. Torres found them 6 weeks later, filed in the county administrative archive under a false reference number that matched Lillian's employee ID reversed. 3 certified property histories, 4 original survey copies, a handwritten index cross-referencing every altered parcel, every forged transfer, every missing page. Enough documentation to prosecute Gerald Whitmore 3 times over. Lillian had filed them the way she filed everything, neatly, precisely, in order, in the place where she believed the truth belonged, not hidden, not buried, filed, waiting for someone to look in the right drawer. The trial took 4 months. Gerald Whitmore pleaded guilty to fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. He received 12 years. He died in prison 18 months later. Raymond Whitmore was convicted of murder, life without parole. Owen Rutledge, already dead, was named in the record as a co-conspirator. His name, which had never appeared in the original file, was entered into the case permanently. Harold Dent, the retired deputy, watched the verdict on a small television in his assisted living room. He called Webb the next morning. Didn't say much. Just, "Thank you for not letting it stay buried." Then he hung up. Brant Mercer was cleared publicly by the sheriff's office in a press conference held in the Maple Ridge Community Center. the same building with Gerald Whitmore's name on a plaque near the entrance. The sheriff read a statement. 21 years of suspicion, formally withdrawn. Grant sat in the second row, wearing a clean shirt and his reading glasses, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't cry. He nodded once when the sheriff said his name. Then he walked out into the parking lot, stood beside his truck, and looked up at the sky for a long time. Naomi was there. She stood beside him. They didn't speak for a while. Then she said, "She was protecting us." "I know," Grant said. "She loved you. She never stopped. Not for a second." He nodded, swallowed, nodded again. They drove out to the farmland east of town the following Sunday. The field where the excavation had taken place was covered now, the soil settled, new grass beginning to green over the disturbed earth. Naomi brought white roses, the same kind Lillian's bouquet had been. She laid them on the ground and stood there with her hands at her sides, the wind moving through the tall grass, the tree line dark and still in the distance. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said. Quiet. "Just for the field. Just for the air. I'm sorry we believed them. I'm sorry we let you be alone out here." She stayed for an hour. Grant stayed with her. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. They stood together in the place where Lillian had walked on weekend afternoons, tracing fence lines, talking about nothing important, and they let the silence hold what words couldn't. The memorial display Naomi had been planning went up at the community center in June. A table with photographs. Lillian at 7, missing a front tooth. Lillian at graduation, her arm around Diane. Lillian and Grant on the church steps during the rehearsal, eating pizza, laughing at something outside the frame. And the restored wedding photograph. The one Dale Furr had enhanced. The one that showed the reflection in the church window. The one that held Owen Rutledge's face, his khaki jacket, his folded note, his 21-year secret. Naomi framed it, hung it at the center of the display. Not as evidence, as proof. Proof that the truth had been there all along, in the glass, in the light, in a single frame that everyone had looked at and no one had truly seen. Diane's house sold in August. Naomi kept the calendar from the kitchen wall, the wedding date still circled, the small red heart still drawn beside it. She hung it in her own kitchen, where her children could see it, where she could see it every morning while she made coffee, not as a reminder that her sister had been brave, that she had fought, that she had loved them enough to carry the weight alone rather than let it touch them. Grant stayed in Maple Ridge. He still did. He retired from construction 2 years ago. He tends a small garden behind the apartment. Tomatoes, peppers, a row of sunflowers along the fence. On July 18th, he still drives out to Grace Community. But he doesn't sit in the parking lot anymore. He walks the grounds, touches the oak tree. But he doesn't sit in the parking lot anymore. He walks the grounds. Stands in the service hallway where the light comes through the side window at a certain angle in the late afternoon, and then he drives home, and the day is his. The restored photograph sits in a case file now, cataloged and sealed. But a copy hangs in Naomi's living room. She looks at it sometimes in the evening's living room. She looks at it sometimes in the evenings. Not the man in the window, not the note in his hands. She looks at the sanctuary behind the reflection, the wooden pews, the arch her father built, the space where her sister was supposed to stand in a white dress, holding roses, about to walk toward a light she'd chosen. Lillian never got to walk that aisle. She never got the cabin near Lake Erie. She never got the cabin near Lake Erie. She never got the Sunday phone calls with her grandmother, the Thanksgiving organizing, the quiet Friday evenings at the kitchen table. She got a field, a tire iron, a secret kept for 21 years. But she also got the last word, filed neatly, in order, in the place where the truth belonged, waiting, patient, certain that someone, someday, would open the right drawer. And someone did. 21 years later, in a box labeled Christmas Kitchen, under a strand of green garland, in an attic that smelled like dust and old paper and a mother's grief, a younger sister reached down and pulled out a small cloth-bound book, and the truth which had been hiding in plain sight since a hot July afternoon in 1998 stepped back into the light. Not with a shout, not with a confession, not with a dramatic reveal, with a photograph. A reflection. A man in a window holding a folded note, and a woman who had believed even at the end that the truth was worth more than her own life, that if she filed it carefully enough, in the right place, in the right order, someone would find it. Someone always does. You just have to look in the right drawer.